education. Take two. Keep talking, keep talking, keep talking. Test, test. How's that? Better?
Oh, you want to hear whether my voice is coming through?
That's very good. That sounds like it. Can you talk, Michelle, please?
Hello.
You need to, yeah, you guys want to just be about up to your chin, okay?
Okay. We will have a conversation.
We'll have a conversation.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you for coming tonight. The Educational Choices Foundation is very pleased to have Dr. Sandra Stotsky with us today. We are privileged to have her here to talk about curriculum and standards and Common Core state standards in particular. Give us a lot of background about that and how it applies to communities across New Hampshire and different alternatives. By way of introduction, I'm going to read Dr. Stotsky's biography for you briefly. Sandra Stotsky is Professor of Education Emerita at the University of Arkansas, where she held the 21st Century Chair in Teacher Quality. She served as Senior Associate Commissioner at the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education from 1999 to 2003, where she was in charge of developing or revising all the state's K-12 standards, teacher licensure tests, and teacher and administrator licensure regulations. She served on the Massachusetts Board of Elementary and Secondary Education from 2006 to 2010, appointed by then Governor Mitt Romney, on the National Mathematics Advisory Panel, appointed by Secretary of Education Margaret Spellings from 2006 to 2008, and on the Common Core Validation Committee, recommended by Massachusetts Commissioner of Education Mitchell Chester from 2009 to 2010. She was one of the 5 members of the validation committee who would not sign off on the standards as being internationally benchmarked, rigorous, or research-based. She was also editor of the premier research journal, Research in the Teaching of English, published by the National Council of Teachers of English from 1991 to 1997. She has published extensively in professional journals and written several books. She did undergraduate work at the University of Michigan and completed a doctorate in reading research and reading instruction at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She was an active citizen in Brookline for many years, serving as president of its League of Women Voters several decades ago. She was an elected town meeting member for 10 years and elected library trustee for 14 years. She also served on many school search and selectmen appointed committees. And we are very honored to have Dr. Stotsky here tonight. Please help me welcome her.
Thank you very much for your welcome. I am pleased to be here in another New Hampshire Town Hall. This is about the 6th Town Hall I have spoken in, and it always brings back memories for me of the very old Town Hall in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, where I grew up. That was a lot older than this one, and as I told somebody earlier tonight, that was a town founded in 1656, so I just about beat every single town I've been here in New Hampshire. What I'm going, and I'm impressed with this town hall because it's the first one that has wallpaper on it. I don't know when that happened, but I have not seen town halls with wallpaper on them for a long, long time. Let me begin. I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes to just give you a little bit of background about the development of Common Core. Some of this may be well known to some of you. I've been saying a lot of this for 5 years now, but just to make sure we've all covered some of the same material, I'll tell a little bit about the validation committee I was on, a very peculiar committee, and some of the problems with the English language arts and math standards, and then we're going to have a chat together which will bring out other information and some questions that my two interlocutors think will be useful for me to answer here in public, and then we'll have a Q&A. As you probably know by now, Common Core was not developed by states. It is not a state-led initiative, even though you will continue to see that in some of the propaganda material that comes out from all of the organizations, sometimes individual people, but mainly the organizations that the Gates Foundation has funded to promote Common Core. This is one of my many problems. I'm constantly trying to give facts, and there are counter-facts that keep being repeated, and I have to keep repeating the facts because people are confused. We all know, and most of the media knows, that Common Core as a project was developed by 3 private organizations in Washington, D.C. the National Governors Association, the Council for Chief State School Officers, and Achieve Incorporated. And they were all funded for this purpose by a 4th private organization, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Because this was all done privately by private organizations, as you probably all understand, no public records are available. No records of anything are available. And even though I kept asking for certain kinds of information, and I suggested to reporters to get more information on the contracts with the writers of the standards, the rationales for who was appointed to the various committees, none of that information is available. You can't FOIA, Freedom of Information request for anything, because the organizations that have copyrighted Common Core's standards are private organizations. This is a fundamental fact that you have got to absorb and think about. How come we are in 45 plus states using privately copyrighted standards for public use in our schools? There's no mechanism for revising them. The tests that your kids are going to be judged by, and that your teachers will be judged by, are all based on these copyrighted standards. It's a very peculiar situation. Let me quickly go through a few other facts, which are all available on the website, my own homepage at the University of Arkansas. Pioneer Institute has many of these on its own website. My homepage, by the way, can be easily Googled and looked at. You just have to Google Sandra Stotsky, Arkansas, and it will be one of the first items that comes up. And it's a secure site, which is why I use it to put all of my papers and testimony and other things on, because it can't be monkeyed with in any way. So we don't know who selected the members of the standards development work groups in 2009. We do know who was on them, because eventually I got that information published in July. Yes, I was the one that kept writing. Remember, I'm an old town meeting member from a small town. And even in Brookline, you can't do anything in private. Everything has to be done openly in triplicate. Otherwise, it's not public. So I kept calling someone at Achieve saying, who is developing these standards? She said she would relay the message to people who were in charge. And finally, in July, Education Week, which is the main newspaper or source of information for people in the K-12 schools, published the list of all those who were developing college-ready standards. Most of them, it turned out, were connected to the testing industry. Very interesting. They were connected to ACT, to CB College Board, to Achieve, and to NCEE. That's Mark Tucker's organization, National Center on Education and the Economy. Who was not on the standards development work groups? High school English teachers, high school math teachers, English professors, engineers, scientists, parents, state legislators, state and local school board members. Most of the people that you would expect in some way to be represented on such a committee. but they weren't there. And what were the qualifications of the people who were selected to write the grade level standards? This is another major issue for me because they have turned out so poorly in so many ways. We don't know why David Coleman and Susan Pimentel, the two chief writers for English language arts, were chosen. They had never taught reading or English. They hadn't majored in English as undergraduates. They don't have a doctorate in English. They had never published any serious work, and in fact, they were not known in the field itself before. Two of the lead grade level standards writers in mathematics were PhDs in math, so they knew the content of math, Jason Zimba and William McCallum, but neither of them had ever taught in K-12, and neither of them had any experience writing K-12 standards. We have no idea to this day who chose them, how much they were paid, what their charge was, why. In addition to this standards development work group in 2009 and these standards writers who were announced by name in the middle of the summer, finally, we had something called the validation committee. That was what I was on. And I got on because I really politicked quite hard in Massachusetts with Mitchell Chester because he was the commissioner and I had helped to hire him when I was on the State Board of Ed, so I figured he owed me a favor. And I got him finally to recommend me to the validation committee, and the day before nominations closed, I got on. I'm sure they have brewed to this day having me on that committee. James Milgram, the mathematician from Stanford University, who was on the committee with me, was the only mathematician. He had been told to be on that committee by then Governor Schwarzenegger of California, who knew of him because Professor Milgram had helped to write California's mathematics standards. So he understood K-12 math standards, and I had helped to write a lot of standards and supervise them in Massachusetts, so I was the only English language arts standards writer, standards expert on the validation committee. Now, what is a validation committee? It's supposed to assure the soundness and rigor of the standards. One of the first things that struck me as peculiar was the fact that this validation committee was chosen, put into place, by the very group that created the standards. Now, any of you who are familiar with public policy at any level know that you do not ask the people who create something to evaluate it. You look for independent experts somewhere, and they're easy to find. Certainly, U.S. Department of Ed could have asked for independent experts in this country, abroad, particularly when there was a huge claim being made that these were internationally benchmarked and rigorous standards. But they didn't, and project managers themselves chose the members of the validation committee. Had less than 30 members, and the two of us that I mentioned, Professor Milgram and I, were the two experts in each in our own area on that committee. It didn't have one high school English teacher, no high school math teacher, plus a lot of other things missing on that committee either. And I always thought if there were to be any people on a validation committee, shouldn't it be the people who teach at the high school level, math and English, who prepare kids for college, or at least high school graduation? And you would also want, at the other end, higher ed, the people who teach freshman or sophomore courses, math or English. They weren't there. So we had this very peculiar committee that was to validate the standards. Its real purpose, obviously, was for us to serve as rubber stamps, and I had known about rubber stamp committees from my experience in town government, but I was not going to be a rubber stamp on this committee, so I was one of the 5 people. Professor Milgram was another one, who would not sign off on these standards when we got a form in May 2010, asking us to affirm that these standards were internationally benchmarked, rigorous, and research-based. He looked at math, I looked at English, and we said, these standards don't make it. This was end of May. Public comment draft had come out in March. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with any of these processes, but a public comment draft may have suggestions for change, but when a final draft comes through, there's got to be a rationale for the changes that have been made, so that those who look at the public comment draft can understand why it's different from that. Well, here is a draft that comes out at the end of May, supposedly based on the public comment draft. It's already different. And as I say, the two of us used to talk to each other about this committee we were on, and we had, on our own, decided not to sign off. 3 other people did also not sign off. And then on June 2 comes the final versions. This is 2010. And he was more shocked than anyone because he said it was a very different set of math standards than what he had seen in March on public comment draft. And he didn't know why. There was no, what was called the third pathway, or a pathway, a STEM pathway to calculus, which was promised in the March draft, never emerged to this day. This is 5 years later. We still do not know what happened behind the scenes, why the stubs that were there on the March draft, which he has a copy of. He's a careful scholar and researcher and keeps copies of everything. There are stubs of place markers that say this is what will be for getting to calculus, and it all disappeared by the final draft, for our final version. And we do not know who made the decision, who agreed, why, and nobody to this day has even talked about it. Yet we have the U.S. Chamber of Commerce going around talking about how we're going to expand the STEM pipeline, when it's very clear to anyone who knows math that we are shrinking rapidly. Why? We do not know. And as any of you who are in science know, it's going to decimate the high school science program as well, because science depends on math. And indeed, you cannot teach the lab-based physics course in grade 12 if the math isn't there. So what happens in your high schools may depend upon having some good math and science teachers and superintendents who want things there, even though they're not supported by Common Core standards. But this is what Professor Milgram has been going around talking to. And he was supported just a few weeks ago. I want to just say this now before I sit down. There was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, maybe a month ago, by a woman mathematician named Marina Ratner. She's emerita at Berkeley. Professor Milgram tells me she's probably the most distinguished female mathematician in the world. And she was looking at what her 6th grade grandchild was learning in math in the Berkeley public schools, California, and was rather shocked, looked into it, and wrote this op-ed saying, this is all bad for mathematics. So we've had eminent mathematicians, people who teach math at the college level or who develop the field of mathematics, saying there are huge problems in Common Core's math. And then we have Department of Ed people, boards of ed, governors running around saying these are rigorous, wonderful, silver bullet, going to cure all of our problems. Not one of them can read a set of math standards. I can't. That's why I constantly ask Professor Milgram whenever I have any issue about math, because I assume that a mathematician knows what he's talking about, or she's talking about, when they're in the field of mathematics. So you have these basic problems with Common Core's standards. Before I just mention briefly, and all of these points are on websites for you to get to further details, I'm always asked, well then how did Massachusetts give up its very good standards, because they were considered one of the best sets of standards across all standards documents before Common Core was adopted by the Board of Ed in place in July 2010. And Governor Patrick answer is simple. $250 million, a race to the top. Money. Money buys you almost anything you want. And it certainly bought Massachusetts standards. It was very important for Secretary Duncan and others to have Massachusetts abandon its own first-class standards, adopt Common Core because there was a line of commissioners of ed, probably including the one here in New Hampshire, who all said that if Massachusetts gave up its standards, then they would adopt Common Core. We would be the sacrificial lamb. After all, we said Common Core was as good as our standards, or even better, then everyone else would go along because everyone else also knew how good our own standards had been, because we have some empirical evidence from NAEP, National Assessment of Educational Progress Tests, and even TIMSS, Trends in International Mathematics and Science Survey, an international test that we had entered as a separate country. Several states did that, and we had been among the top, if not the top. So we knew that our standards have contributed from the early 2000s to the Bay State students' level of achievement. And that is why I congratulate the little town of Wakefield, New Hampshire, that decided not to adopt Common Core and to adopt at least Massachusetts math and English pre-2009 standards. This is part of the Ohio bill that is now being testified to and being looked at right now as we speak. I testified on it 2 weeks ago. They want the old Massachusetts standards adopted for a 2-year interim period while they develop their own Ohio-based standards in math and English. And they expect this year, last year they couldn't get it out of committee, it was killed in committee. This year it's being heard by a different committee. They expect to get it out of the Rules and Regulations Committee. It's an all-Republican state, but that isn't the issue. There are divisions within, as in West Virginia, where I was last week. And they're going to see whether they can get this way of handling the transition period, which turns out to be the next beachhead that the defenders of Common Core are fighting on. Well, we've invested 4 years now in Common Core implementation. How can we get rid of it? Look at all the money we've spent, et cetera, et cetera. And I testified that you will probably spend less money if you adopt the old Massachusetts standards, because when I helped create them at the high school level, they were created with the idea that high school teachers would see their own disciplinary training reflected in what they were asked to teach to, and wouldn't have to be PD'd to death, professionally developed to death. And they didn't. In Massachusetts, we did not have large expenses for professional development. So it may be cheaper to get rid of Common Core as soon as you can and go to an interim set of standards that are actually not only cheaper, but of more rigor, of a higher quality, get you in the right direction while you develop your own standards. Major flaws in English, and I think I'm going to stop right after that so we can have more questions. In ELA, probably the most serious problem is that most of the standards are content-free skills. They're not true standards. So you have a skill that can be applied at any level of reading difficulty, like main idea, supporting evidence. You have to have other things to indicate what grade level difficulty for reading purposes your selections should be. And that is in Common Core. It was deliberately left open. It wasn't open at the local level so much as it was open for the test developers, who, as I told you, were on the first committees, because they don't want severe guidelines. They like as much flexibility and as openness as possible for when they create items. And then the question is, what level of difficulty are these passages, and then where will the cut score or pass score be? So the first issue is that these are content-free skills, and there's nothing to indicate, basically, level of difficulty. Secondly, they stress writing more than reading at every grade level. And this is something I say to all teachers who may be present. If there is one thing our students need in K-12, it's to have more time on reading. Good writers have always been good readers. If you want to develop good writers, you develop good readers. That's what comes first. And there's 100 years of research that I know about that would support it. Turns out, there's another flaw that Common Core's writing standards are developmentally inappropriate at many grade levels and aren't coordinated with its reading standards. When kindergartners are asked to write a paragraph, you know something's wrong with the standard. Whatever your normal kindergartner is in New Hampshire or anywhere else, you're not going to be able to write a paragraph. There are some other issues that we've heard a lot about. Informational texts are being increased. No one knows exactly what they are, except they seem to have a lot of political spin to many of them. And complex literary texts have been decreased by the mandates that David Coleman wrote in. It's been extraordinary that one person was able to mandate about a 50% focus on something called informational text and another 50% on literary text, which is not what English teachers have been trained to do in the secondary grades. But the damage has been done, and the tests will probably reflect mainly informational text. We don't know yet because they haven't come out, so we can't show any examples. You will get samples, but we have no idea how representative these samples are because the samples have been chosen by the test developers. It's an inside job all the way through. The public has been sort of shut out of the whole process. It's being done behind the scenes and through governors, state boards of ed, commissioners of ed, and basically local school boards have just gone along. Something we'll talk more about. So we have problems with the English language arts standards that would almost require a total rewrite, except there's no way to rewrite them. Because there's no mechanism, and they're copyrighted. That's all I'm going to say now, and then we can have some more questions from our interlocutors here. Okay.
Thank you. That was a fantastic introduction to what Common Core is or isn't. I have a couple of questions just to kind of bring it back a little bit. I know there's a lot of talk. I talk to a lot of people about education and standards and curriculum. A lot of people don't really know the difference between a standard and a curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain the difference between a standard and a curriculum?
Could you use the mic? Use the mic too.
I think I'm mic'd up already.
Oh, okay.
He's just got to be able to talk more on that one, as I understand the system here, sorry. The question is, what's the difference between a standard and a curriculum? And that is something that has been confusing, and it's often deliberately confused. A standard, generally speaking in education, is an intellectual objective. This is where you want to end with, what you want to aim for, to go for. It's simply a goal, a kind of academic goal. A curriculum is what you put in place to reach that goal. And what we have been told over and over again is that teachers will choose whatever they want to reach the goal. But if there are, as we know from previous experience with state standards and curriculum, if the tests are to have any teeth, which generally speaking is the reason to have state tests when we had state standards, what it means is that teachers will look to see what's on the test, and then that becomes part of the curriculum, or they figure out how to get it into the curriculum because they now have a better clue about what is being assessed and how it's being assessed. So even though you're told that Common Core is just a set of standards, words on paper, and the curriculum is up to the local teachers, we already have Common Core aligned curriculum materials being sold. Every publisher immediately went and stamped their materials, no matter what was in them, as Common Core aligned. And we have Gates Foundation funded vetting committee a couple of weeks ago that was announced that will examine the curriculum materials that are out there and issue reports on to what extent they address Common Core standards, our Common Core line, or are not. Now, anyone with any common sense is going to know that schools will look to see which curriculum materials are given high grades, which ones low grades, by this, not only Gates Foundation, but he's getting his other pals from the corporate world involved in supporting this vetting operation. That will make it very clear what materials should be used so that school systems whose kids don't do as well as maybe parents think they should or somebody thinks they should will be told, well, maybe you're not using the right materials. Maybe you've got to make your curriculum more aligned. See, all of this is still a game that's being played out, so we don't know all of the answers yet. But it's sort of easy to speculate if you're a chess player to figure out where some of this is going, because at some point they have to show what they're trying to do with each new phase, particularly as the tests are being developed now and will be given next year come hell or high water. As you know, they're not going to delay giving the tests. They may delay the accountability for teachers, because that was one of the major uses that Duncan wanted to make of the test scores. Each state had to have a contract in some way to show what percentage of the kids' scores would be used for evaluating the teachers. Because one of the new things about Common Core that's different from No Child Left Behind, and it's sort of just pushing the camel under the tent even more. Camel's nose got under the tent to begin with no Child Left Behind, but now the rest of the camel is following, and that is that under No Child Left Behind, schools were held accountable. That was what AYP was all about. Common Core and Race to the Top have made teachers accountable. Not schools, but teachers. And every now and then, Duncan lets slip. We still don't know. It hasn't been developed yet, and I don't know where the teacher unions are on this, because I can't imagine how they could let it go through. But he wants to see an equitable distribution of effective teachers. Now, what does that mean? That you just tell teachers who've been examined through value-added methodology statistically and declared effective that we're going to move you to this school or we're going to move you to that district? This sort of thing, labor planning, labor workforce planning, was sort of half-heartedly tried in a few other countries in the last half-century. Never worked out too well. People went where they were told, but they tried to get back from Siberia to civilization as fast as possible. So I don't know where this is all going to end when somebody at the USDE says, well, you've got an imbalance of your effective teachers. Too many of them are in Windham, and not enough of them are in the local suburb, the local towns around here. So we got to move them. And so what if a teacher protests? Well, goodbye. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen. Anyway, that's a long-winded answer to that question.
I can add to that a little bit. In New Hampshire in 2013, the legislature passed a law that holds teachers accountable at 20%. 20% of their evaluation is based upon these exams. So teachers are motivated to teach to these tests because their very jobs will depend upon it. They're held to that. And that was required as a condition for receiving the waiver from the No Child Left Behind requirements. So our Department of Education had to work with, convince, maybe that's a little strong, but had to convince the legislature to pass that law in order to obtain the waiver. And that was in 2013. And it was almost immediately upon that being signed into law that we received that waiver. So it is in effect here in this state.
And we should be grateful that it's as low as 20%. I was in Colorado a month and a half ago, and Mike Johnston, who is the Speaker of the House there, several years ago, as almost within a year after the board adopted Common Core standards, got the legislature to adopt a bill making their evaluations hinge on 50% of scores. Now, last year when I was there testifying, one of the teacher unions was unhappy about the fact, several years later, not surprisingly, saying, let's get rid of the 50%. Let's not have any percent. And so far as I know, they haven't rescinded the bill. The legislature has not undone the bill. So 20% is where it's starting in New Hampshire. But if you've got a few states that have gone as high as 50, I'm sure it will be raised gradually to 50 in some way. If the legislature doesn't do it, the governor's executive order can do it. I mean, there are different ways to get to the same goal.
You mentioned Massachusetts standards, and you were part of the committee, or ran the committee that developed those. Can you explain, and we know how good they were. I think most people here would acknowledge that Massachusetts had some of the best standards in the world. Can you explain what makes some standards like Massachusetts standards better than other standards such as Common Core?
I can describe it from the point of view of the philosophy I brought to the charge I had. I didn't write all the standards in math or science or history or even in English, because I threw on groups of teachers and had good committees of experts from higher ed as well as from the schools to help me. But the philosophy was that we were going to focus on content, knowledge. We were going to, as I mentioned earlier, make sure that the high school standards reflected the disciplinary background of teachers. Now, why does this somehow turn out to be more important than I ever thought? I was doing that mainly in science because at the time we were developing those science standards, and I say this because there's a new problem coming down the pike, and I don't know where in New Hampshire next generation science standards are.
I can answer that one.
Are they being voted on, or have they already been adopted?
Voted? No. The New Hampshire Board of Education might be adopting them as early as next week. The Board of Education has a meeting on Tuesday the 9th. And last I looked, I have to admit it's been more than a week since I've looked up their agenda. It was not published at that time. But the Board of Education has already promised to adopt the next generation science standards. By the way, they call it next generation instead of Common Core because that label is now so toxic. They're hoping that nobody notices. Okay?
And they're not really done as Common Core standards. Common Core is on English and math,
True.
and Achieve has done the science standards.
So
different.
these next generation science standards were promised to be adopted sometime in 2014.
In
They're coming.
Massachusetts, it will be 2015. They're already sneaking them in.
They're coming. It's already been promised. It's just a matter of sometime in the next couple months.
But those are even worse than its math standards. But let me go back to the question you asked about what I was trying to do. Aside from focusing on content and trying to get what teachers taught at the high school level reflecting the backgrounds they had from their undergraduate majors, typically in whatever they were teaching at the high school level. Science was a problem because at that time, integrated science standards were being pushed. Now, today, the math, Common Core is trying to push, in subtle ways, integrated math, which is almost as bad as integrated science. But integrated science was a horror in Massachusetts. It was introduced in '96. I wasn't in the department at that time. And the high schools tried to figure out how to integrate all four sciences in 9, 10, 11, and 12. And when I came into the department and was trying to revise after getting lots of, the department had already gotten a lot of critical comment from the schools, 2001, turned out, I said, well, we're going to revise standards. I want to get it back to physics, chemistry, biology, and earth science, and some way of doing things with the separate disciplines, sub-disciplines within science. But how many high schools have already moved to an integrated science approach, so we would be damaging them by going back? Well, it turned out that only 5 high schools in the entire state had even tried to integrate science standards. And why had they given it up? Because the teachers couldn't do it. No teachers could teach all 4 of the 4 sub-areas in science at every grade level. And if they tried to arrange a schedule so that you bring in the chemistry teacher for the first month, and then the physics teacher for the next month, and the biology teacher for the next month, it was beyond what they could cope with at the high school level. So they just kept what they had, hated the integrated test because the test had integrated test items, and said, get rid of integrated science. So we got rid of integrated science, and within a year, those 5 communities all went back to what they had had before, with a great deal of happiness and jubilation in those science departments because they hadn't been able to do integrated science. It sounds like it might be interesting, but it just doesn't work out given the way teachers are trained as undergraduates in a chemistry department, a biology department, or a physics department, or whatever. Now the math is a little trickier, but when I was on the National Math Panel, and we looked at the research on integrated math versus single subject math, as it's often called, it turned out that there was no research showing one was any better than the other, and a few of our foreign-born mathematicians who had grown up, say, in Hong Kong or some other place, had had what was called integrated math in other countries, but they said it's nothing like what the Americans do when they call it integrated math. You have 2 months of algebra and then 2 months of geometry, and you actually learn to mastery whatever it is you're learning in either algebra or geometry. So even though both are taught at every year, and that's why it's called integrated, you're not changing every week or every day what you're doing. It dilutes these sub-disciplines, particularly the algebra component, which needs a lot of time on it in high school. And it also makes it difficult to have sequences that make sense for these single subjects or sub-disciplines in math. And it's not taught that way at the college level. You don't have integrated math taught at the college level to prospective people in math or engineering, whether they're going into teaching or not. They're simply not taught by integrated math subjects, typically as undergraduates. Maybe you have interdisciplinary work later on, but not as undergraduates. So your teachers have to be able to teach it. Otherwise, and this is the problem with the geometry approach in Common Core, and I don't know whether you've spoken to your high school math teachers about it or not, but what was put into Common Core for the approach to Euclidean geometry is an approach that was only tried once elsewhere, turns out in the Soviet Union in the 1970s, and it turned out so bad they gave it up within a couple of years. So it didn't work, and yet it's put into Common Core, and math high school teachers don't know how to teach it. It's an approach to Euclidean geometry that involves something called transformations. I can't tell you more because I'm not a mathematician, but anyone who's a mathematician understands it because it's something at the college level that makes sense, but not in grade 10 for an approach to Euclidean geometry, which has always been proof-based, for those of you who remember your grade 10 Euclidean geometry course, which I did because we used Euclid's book when I went to high school. It had been around for 2,000 years, you know, it was still being used, but it was called Euclid's Elements of Geometry, and small town schools all used that for teaching geometry when they did teach it. And so today's high school math teachers are flummoxed because they're being asked to teach Euclidean geometry, which has become less and less proof-based over the years anyway, but they're being asked to teach it in a way that they've never been trained to teach, can't teach, and there's no indication that it's successful. What's going to happen? We don't know. I mean, maybe the teachers will be held accountable, but your kids aren't going to learn. They should be learning. I mean, the bottom line is going to be what happens to your kids. So that was what I tried to make sure, and that was what happened when I was in charge in Massachusetts. We were trying to have standards that focused on content and that raised everybody. And that was a major part of my philosophy. We weren't trying to close gaps, whatever kind of gaps there were. The entire boat had to get raised. And that is not what Common Core is about. Common Core seems to be about trying to push up the bottom grades too high, because childhood experts have complained about the inappropriateness of the early primary grade standards, and then it lowers the ceiling on the high school so that you don't have the STEM preparation standards that in math that will get you to calculus for the first year math science courses in an engineering school, never mind a science major, economics major, finance major, math major. Just not there. So that was part of what happened in Massachusetts, and that was part of the, quotes, Massachusetts education miracle. We were making standards that teachers felt comfortable with, could teach to, and were strong and clear.
So, speaking about the math standards, can you just inform the people who are here tonight some of the achievements that the state of Massachusetts?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about what happened, and it's available for anyone to confirm by looking at NAEP's test scores. By 2005, remember these new standards that I was in charge of were being done in 2000, 2001, 2002, and 2003 for history, which we never got a test for because that was when they finally figured out how to make sure that the test never took place. It was to be of our constitutional period and principles. I'll get to history in a minute because we have a real problem coming up with the advanced placement U.S. history course. Don't know whether you use it here, but you should ban it from your schools if you can. But in any event, what we had were these other sets of standards that were in place with state tests based upon them. And by 2005, Massachusetts kids hit first place on NAEP's tests in both grade 4, grade 8, in reading and in math, both areas, and they've done it 5 consecutive test years. This has been amazing to people in Massachusetts. Better yet, on TIMS, the international test, which we entered in as a country, just to see whether the international test scores confirmed in any way. In 2007, we hit tied for first on science in grade 8. And I know the standards helped out because we had wonderful examples that I had paid some scientists to write. So those elementary teachers who aren't very comfortable with elementary science had a good example for every single standard right in their own document. In any event, we tied for first place in grade 8. We were among the top in math in grade 4 and 8 on TIMS, which corroborated what we had on the NAEP test. So even though we had our state test being given every year, we had independent evidence that our kids were really doing better. And best of all, and this was like the little jewel in the crown, we have about 30 regional vocational technical high schools in Massachusetts. They're 4-year high schools, 9 to 12. They're schools of choice. I want them to be seen that way because kids do go there after grade 8 by choice. And at first, they didn't want to take the state test because their kids were bombing. They have a disproportionate number of kids on IEPs. Many of them have reading problems. They go there by choice. They're not in any way dumped on by feeder schools into these regional voc tech schools. But the board and the commissioner and all the rest of us agreed that they should have to take the same test as kids in the regular schools. They bit the bullet, and they did remediation, and within a few years, their kids are now, because remember, they're attending by choice. These kids want to be in those schools. They wouldn't be there if it wasn't by choice. they are now almost all passing. There's a practically zilch attrition rate from 9 to 12. They don't drop out. And the pass rate on English is like 95% to 100. In math, it's a little lower than that, but most of them are passing. And most of the schools have waiting lists, long waiting lists. That's choice. Now, does Duncan like them? No, he doesn't like vocational technical schools. But I have visited, when I was on the Board of Ed, a number of the ones in Massachusetts. The kids are happy. They've been there by choice. They can always go back to their regular high school if they don't want. But when they graduate, they know they will have an occupational trade. They can go to work if they want. About half go on to some sort of post-secondary technical institute. And they are probably among the happiest adolescents you can see in any school system. And when I asked a couple of superintendents of these schools how the kids how they choose to go there, they're chosen because they apply and they have to be interviewed. That's part of the procedure now. But many of them had parents who went to these schools, and they could see that these schools have an array of different programs in different schools depending upon what local industry has to offer. And they are one of the best success stories of what the standards did, because they really wanted to make the kids know that in English, math, and then when science was a high school diploma requirement, they'd have to pass whatever the other kids did elsewhere. They were not inferior or different in terms of their basic academic subjects. They had to do the same thing other kids did. Then they could have their shop courses, which is what they were there for, because that was why they chose to be in the school. So there are a number of pluses that came out, but that is what I like to mention because most states need to do a lot more with the vocational technical option for high school for our kids, where a lot of them would be much happier if they'd stay in school and graduate instead of dropping out. And they would have a trade that they could earn something right away. Okay.
So talking about tests, I hear a lot of talk about assessments these days. When I was going through school, we didn't take formal assessments, we were tested. What's the difference between the tests that we used to take versus the assessments now that are going to be mandated under Common Core?
Yeah. Well, in the olden times, when I went to school, grandchildren say in the 19th century, Grandma, we had teacher tests. And so that was mainly what we took. Teacher-made tests. Teachers developed tests based upon what they taught. And then there might have been the SAT, which came in around 1900. Later than that, excuse me, because after World War II, the SATs were developed. You had college boards that were developed after 1900 because there was a need for some standardization of what kids knew if they were applying to a number of different colleges around the country. So we had mainly teacher-made tests almost all the way through K-12 years ago. Smarter Balance, which is the Common Core-based test that you're going to be giving here in New Hampshire, is probably a totally unknown test to your teachers. This is one of the things I keep talking about. There were 2 testing consortia funded by the USDE in 2010, and they've been busy spending a lot of money and developing tests. But again, they're private. They're behind the scenes. We don't know what experts they've been using, who has been vetting these tests, and how they've been using teacher groups for feedback. Very different from state tests, for example, in Massachusetts that were based on the standards that I helped to supervise the development of. So you've got Smarter Balance coming in with performance assessments as well as computer-adapted tests, test items, which means kids go to a computer. Ideally, that's what they want everyone to be on a computer so the results get immediately totaled up. And computer-based results for multiple choice can be fed back right away, which is supposedly one of the advantages, unless, of course, there are glitches, which turn out to be many when you're using computers. But in any event, kids will be using computer adaptive tests, which means that if they don't do well on one test item, the next test item will be easier. If they do well on a test item, they'll be given a harder one. That means ultimately that there has to be a way of figuring out how to make equivalence out of all these different test items, which is why they had a pilot test, thousands of test items in the last year, and they've been doing it all over the country. But you're getting tests given that have been developed elsewhere and that your teachers have not seen, have nothing to do with, and parents will not ever see the results. One of the great things about the legislation in Massachusetts, by statute from the Ed Reform Act of '93, test items used on state tests every year had to be released publicly, so everyone could see what the test items were. It's not happening with Smarter Balance or PARC, P-A-R-C-C, which is the acronym for the other testing consortium. No one's ever going to know what happened on these tests. Now, what's interesting to me, in Nashua, in December last year, a principal, or the superintendent, I was told, asked the teachers in one school, Fairgrounds Middle School, to take a preliminary version of Smarter Balance. And it's up on the web. And then after the teachers took this preliminary version, the principal, John Nelson of that school, asked the teachers to give him their impressions. And uniformly, they hated the test. They didn't want it. They thought it demanded too much technologically and that it didn't assess what they were teaching the kids. So that was why I had been told Nashua wrote to the Department of Ed here saying they don't want to take Smarter Balance. Too bad, you got to take it. State law. So here were some teachers that actually took the test, preliminary version. It's true, there might be differences now. I doubt that it would be changed that much. And they didn't like what they saw. Now, I had a chance to sort of confirm that because Mitchell-Chester, Massachusetts, this past spring, gave Massachusetts school committees and superintendents the choice of continuing for one more year with MCAS, our old state test for high school competency requirement, those reasons, or to switch to PARCC, SBAC's Smarter Balance's counterpart. And school systems that had been piloting PARCC occasionally had an alert reporter for a local newspaper who attended the school meeting where the superintendent gave the recommendation. I got a hold of these few reports that were in local newspapers. It's never going to be a state report. I mean, you have to be on the alert where you can find this information. And it turned out that the superintendent of the Bridgewater Raynham schools, which is why I got a hold of it because my brother reads that paper from 40, 50 years ago, and said, Sandy, you're probably going to want to see what the superintendent had to say. And she recommended that they stay with MCAS for another year, not go with PARC, and that all of them who looked at what the teachers were saying, they didn't quote, the reporter didn't quote teachers, she quoted principals and superintendents. They had nothing good to say about PARC. So I thought PARC was probably just as bad as Smarter Balance. And the superintendent said there were some problems with the Algebra 1 test, which she didn't specify, or at least the reporter couldn't figure out what to say about it. So we know that there are some issues that superintendents themselves have picked up from their own staff with the other Common Core-based test. What was interesting was that the superintendent said, oh, we've been talking to each other and we've picked up some problems with that Algebra 1 test. And who does she mean she's talking to? Other superintendents in the state. So they know more than we know. It's just that they're not saying anything because they don't want to get into trouble with their State Department of Ed or their state boards of ed. I mean, we understand that some of them may want to have a job elsewhere. This is part of the Damocles sword that hangs over their heads. So you've got all kinds of problems to worry about, because you can't get information directly from the right people. But there was one, and then I looked and Googled and found a couple of other local reporters who had reported on their community's decision to stay with MCAS. And indeed, there was confirmation that they had problems with the pilot test of Park. Does that mean that Mitchell Chester, who is the chairman of the governing board of Park, by the way, talk about conflict of interest, is not going to recommend next year in Massachusetts? Then sit down. Come on. Is not going to recommend to the State Board of Ed that they fully adopt Park because it's going to be wonderful for Massachusetts students. What's more, and this is what I got from someone who was on the Peabody School Committee last month, turns out that there was a request to the legislature for a state budget item for next year to pay for new testing demands of Park. So they got it through in advance. State legislature just apparently caved right in. Didn't care. They were told this is going to be good for the kids. We're requesting the State Department of Ed and the State Board of Ed, maybe the governor too, for the budget for next year to include more money for testing. And the legislature put it in, and it passed the House. No, I should say we don't know if it's passed the Senate yet. I'm sorry. Maybe it hasn't passed the Senate, it passed the House. So there still might be some play possible in Massachusetts on that issue. But that's the answer, very long-winded, to your question about current state tests, which have a performance aspect that will take place in the classroom, and your old teacher-made test from years ago.
I wanted to follow up on that testing.
Okay.
Here's the snack break.
I don't understand why local boards do that. Local school board, I'm in school board.
Oh, wow, there really are snacks. Help yourself, grab some. Yum.
They're coming out with more and more awesome tasting movies.
Great, we'll continue now. I wanted to follow up on that discussion about tests and the smarter balance assessments, because as many of you may have heard, just this week, it was announced that although Manchester wanted a waiver from using the smarter balanced assessments, it's now officially denied. Up to this point, Dr. Virginia Berry, who is the commissioner of our State Department of Ed, has led Manchester to believe that they could obtain this waiver. Apparently, that's not so. You may or may not know that late last year, Londonderry requested a waiver to use some other testing mechanism. And the Board of Ed, our Department of Education waited, stalled, refused to answer, and it took more than 6 months for it to come back. No, you can't have the waiver, and they said it was because the U.S. Department of Education had to give the approval. So my question to you, Dr. Stotsky, is what about these waivers? Can or should local boards be able to obtain them? What would be appropriate alternatives?
Well, I'll tell you Department of Ed for
That's
a waiver.
right.
I would simply
Exactly.
not give the test, period. And then my idea is that we need to call the bluff of the bullies, both at the USED and at the state departments of ed. No matter what the statutes actually say, there have to be ways before a judge, state Supreme Court, to be able to say that these tests that come from outside the state have never been vetted by anyone in higher ed in the state, certainly at the high school level, for college readiness purposes, that these are simply not under a federal form of government test that we can accept. That's it. And just not give them. Now, what would the consequences be? I was talking about that earlier during the supper hour. We don't know, but we are pretty sure that they would not call out the National Guard and arrest all the school board members. What could they do? So they could withhold state-appropriated money by the state legislature that goes to a local community for low-income kids, typically. Does that make them look bad? Yeah. I don't know that they would do that. Maybe they would, but that would be what you'd have to risk, and it's worth risking because it's not clear, by the way, that any of that money has made much of a difference, by the way, which is why we have Common Core. Anyway, I mean, let's think about, all the money that has been spent on that's come through Title I since 1965, when ESEA was first approved under President Johnson. We spend more money per child in this country than any other country in the world, and yet we certainly don't have the results to show for it. Maybe less money would be good. Get rid of the 10%. 10% about of our total school spending budget comes from the federal government. It's tail wagging the dog. So I don't know that we would risk a great deal by just saying, let's get rid of the test. We're not going to give it. Now, if there were other things like accreditation, when I say this in another state, someone will say, oh, they accredit high schools, or they accredit our school systems, and if we don't have accreditation, something will happen to our kids when they want to go to college. I don't know whether any of this will really matter. These are all recently assumed duties by state departments of ed or state boards of ed. And frankly, they never existed years ago. Kids went to college. It didn't matter what the accreditation of their own high school was. I know about NEASC, New England Association of Schools and Colleges. Years ago, when I was more active in Brookline locally, I remember they did an accreditation of Wellesley, which is a very posh suburb outside of Boston, and withheld accreditation of Wellesley High School because they said its library didn't have enough materials in it, something like that. So did anything happen to Wellesley students applying to colleges around the country? Not a thing. No one cared. No one cared that they didn't have their accreditation from NEASC. And of course, Wellesley school officials asked Wellesley Town Meeting to appropriate the money for the library so they could get the accreditation, which they eventually did. But did it make any difference for the 2 years that they didn't have accreditation, the graduating seniors? None that we can figure out, that anyone I know of knows. So, to go back to my basic advice, civil disobedience, targeted civil disobedience. Everyone reads in grade 11, Henry David Thoreau's famous essay, still around, and there is no reason why locally elected school boards, who are still locally elected, and therefore have some legal authority with their school district, can say, sorry, we're not adopting a test because we have a better set of standards. We've adopted something different from Common Core, a better curriculum in our high schools. We've certainly fixed up the high school math and science curriculum better than what's in Common Core, and we're not interested in your state test results. That's it. So what can they do? Let them do whatever they think they can do. They're trying to bully. You know what happened this week in Lee County, Florida. Last week, Lee County, Florida's school board voted not to take the test in Florida, the state test. And 2 days ago, one member of the school board was apparently so harassed by outside pressure groups, including the State Department of Ed, that said we're going to tie you into knots. Not you literally, but the whole county. That they called a special school committee meeting, school board meeting, yesterday morning, and she recanted her vote. So now they have not officially voted not to give the state test. But this was, and this is supposedly a state-led, voluntary state-led project. I mean, there's still some people trying to convince us of that. It was clear that this is a strong-arm method, that it's political. It's got nothing to do with the education of kids. It's about power and control. That is what is underneath all of this. How to centralize a form of central planning that they're trying to get through, and they've been very successful because no one seems to be willing to call their bluff.
So, I'm sorry.
I have the answer to your question. The letter that Manchester got, Dr. Livingston, superintendent, from Virginia Berry, the Department of Education, said that if we don't take the test, we could lose nearly $2.5 million in educational building funding, and nearly $17 million in our district in federal funding. That's almost $20 million. That's the spread.
That Manchester would
Could lose almost $20 million just 1 year.
Okay. Call her bluff. That's it. And let her withhold the money, and then let the legislature take some action against her.
Makes you rethink that concept about bullying in schools.
Yeah.
These are bullies.
Who's the bully?
Political bullies.
So if local school boards won't resist this, what can parents do? What about parents being able to opt out of
Well,
these
parents
tests?
can take their kids out. They don't need permission. And I've been saying this since the beginning of the opt-out movement. Parents can keep their kids home if they're sick, if they want to go on vacation. They've always had that right. I mean, no one's ever said a parent has to ask for permission to keep a kid at home. You send an excuse note afterwards. That's the courtesy you give to your child's teacher. But you don't have to ask for permission. And you can always send your kid to school with a note that says, I want my kid taught today. No test given. I want my kid taught. And if enough parents do it, then they better provide teaching. They can't put the kid into a closet or a study hall or whatever it is they might do to the kid. But, you know, some parents, many of them can't keep their kids at home if they're out working. But they can expect their schools to find something useful, because they are spending, most schools, an enormous amount of time preparing for these tests, because the teachers are legitimately frightened if they're going to be evaluated, even without student scores, on their, quotes, professional attitude about the tests. You know, there are different ways to have an evaluation scheme that makes teachers think twice about whatever they might do. So there are things parents can do not to encourage the testing to take place, or to work out alternatives, sites, babysitting sites or something like that. The schools complaining that it doesn't have a place to put the kids.
One more question from up here before we open it up to the audience. We hear a lot of talk about Common Core being rigorous. You touched briefly upon that in the opening remarks. Could you go into more depth about rigor in standards?
Yeah, what does rigor mean? And I've actually written a short blog that's on the Pioneer Institute website. If you really want to look at rigor, I mean, I've evaluated dozens and dozens of ELA documents over the past 20 years. And there are certain things you look at. Crosswalks, which are comparisons that state departments of ed love to do, are the least useful way to examine, and yet those are the only things they know how to do. But you look at the organization of a set of standards. In English, every subject is organized differently because the discipline is different. But you look to see whether the focus is on literary study, because that is what you want your English teachers in the secondary grades to focus on. So you want to see if literary study is in some way emphasized. There are things you need to look for. In math, you look at whether all the major strands, numbers, algebra, geometry, measurement, to see whether they're all there and to what extent they're there from year to year. I mean, you have to look to see. Rigor means something according to when you teach something. So you want to find out, and this is what Milgram did, by the way, with the K to 6 standards in math. He knew what Singapore Math's own objectives were from grade to grade, and he knew when the standard algorithms were taught. Now, these are the common arithmetical operations that we all learn how to do in elementary school. Turned out that in Common Core they do teach standard algorithms. Well, about 20 years ago this was a big argument whether we should even teach them or not. And certain reform math programs didn't want to teach them at all. Kids would have invented their own algorithms. But in any event, that battle seemed to have been won. However, Common Core allows kids to develop their own algorithms and then has the standard algorithm taught, according to Professor Milgram, a year or two later than when it's introduced in Singapore, which means that our kids will be behind by 1 or 2 years, their competitors. One of the things most of these Southeast Asian and a few European countries that follow the same kind of curriculum do is make sure that kids by grade 3, 4 at the latest, know all these arithmetical operations, standard algorithms, by heart. I mean, they've got a mastery, a secure mastery of that. So then they can go on with problem solving and into higher level material, having mastered the earlier stuff. They don't ever need to review it again. It's just that they focus on certain things and make sure that they're learned early. And that's part of rigor when you introduce something. So that's what has to be looked at. You have to make a note of what it is you're introducing. When? In math, it's a little easier to tell. One of the other problems in math that others, as well as Professor Milgram, have noticed, when can you complete Algebra 1? In Massachusetts, we allowed schools to be able to complete it in grade 8, which is what our higher achieving schools want to be able to do. By a few years ago, almost 50% of our kids in Massachusetts were taking and completing Algebra 1 by grade 8, which meant that 9 could be geometry, 10 Algebra 2, 11 trigonometry, 12 calculus. So they could get in the full math sequence for those going into a STEM career before they went to college. Because it turned out when I looked at what our engineering colleges in Massachusetts were requiring, at least 4 of them wanted kids to have had calculus, not just MIT. 4 of them wanted kids to have had it by grade 12. So that's part of looking at rigor. Common Core doesn't have rigor because it doesn't even enable kids to get to calculus within the framework that it's worked out for its standards at all. It's harder in English. You've got to see what kinds of passages, but most of what's there, even in the high school, is written so poorly. It has such poorly written standards that most high school English teachers are told usually that they have to unpack the standards in order to interpret them. Now, if you've got to unpack a standard, you don't have a standard. You've got an interpretation problem. But that's as much as I can say about rigor, because it depends upon what grade level you're teaching something, before or after, how you've organized a document, what you put your emphasis on in the document, and each subject will have its own emphases, and you need academic experts to help you figure it out, as well as high school teachers in grades 11 and 12, who are the end of the line of your school system, and those are the ones that were excluded from Common Core.
Okay, we'll open this up to questions from the public.
Funny you mentioned Henry David Thoreau, and I'm an English teacher and also a college English education teacher. Have been for about 10 years now at that level. And I would submit to you that you'd be surprised how few English teachers nowadays teach Henry David Thoreau in 11th grade, or the Scarlet Letter, or the Odyssey, and such. One of the things that I would hope you could talk about is why is it so important that certain content, even in English language arts, and especially at the secondary level, be enumerated in standards? Why do we need to make sure we say, students should probably read Huck Finn and Scarlet Letter and things like that? Now, we know there's a big political part of that, but can you articulate that because a lot of teachers don't understand it anymore.
First of all, let me say that no state set of standards, and probably no city standards, would ever specify specific works, because specific titles are usually the prerogative of the English teacher. You want to leave it that way. I don't know that New Hampshire has, in statute, any required readings. Legislators can require readings. And in Massachusetts, we actually have a requirement of the Federalist Papers in statute. It's the only thing, and I thought it had been put in the 19th century by some anonymous state legislator. And I happened to speak to Tom Birmingham at a Pioneer Institute breakfast about 6 months ago, and I was asking him if he knew the origin of the Federalist Papers in our state statute, and he said, I put it in there. So I found out how it got in, because when he was writing the Ed Reform Act, he decided, he had been a government major, that the Federalist Papers is something that everyone should be familiar with before they graduate from high school. So he got the legislature to approve. So it doesn't say what grade level or how many of the papers, whatever, but he put it in, this Democrat, remember. So he was able to get this put in, and it's been in there ever since. Typically, legislators don't require. I began to look throughout the country, and maybe only a fourth of our legislators. New Hampshire may require a state constitution, and that's about it. They typically don't. And the standards have to be such that they guide you to the right literary periods, movements, or traditions, so that you cover what is needed for understanding the English language. This is the way I usually phrase it. If you're talking about the English language arts, the purpose of the English language arts curriculum in our public schools has always been to make sure that kids understand and can use the language they need for informed citizenship, because the purpose of going to high school, graduating from public high school, is to be an informed citizen, and town meetings are exactly the form of citizen activity that most of us could have seen the K-12 public schools set up for. So you've got the English language always as a required subject, typically in most schools from K to 12. And you want to be able to specify British literature in some way, because British literature fed into American literature historically. More than that, you want to fit in classical literature somehow, which we did in Massachusetts standards. We said in grade 9 and 10, and I had approval from all of our English teachers for this, by the way, because we always sent this out for comment and approval, that kids have to become familiar with the themes and structures of classical epic poetry. It sounds esoteric, but what it meant was the Iliad, the Odyssey, or the Aeneid. And it also meant, because our English teachers on our assessment committees decided that it was important for our test item passages to reflect what the standards were requiring. They had to be based on the standards. And they decided, among the criteria that they proposed, that 60%, think of this now with Common Core, because this was a decision made by high school and other middle school English teachers in Massachusetts back in 1997, after the first version had been finished of our ELA standards. They decided that 60% of all the passages should be literary, 40% could be non-literary. And of those 60% that were literary, over half had come from Appendix A, which was a code word for literary and civic heritage. They knew what they wanted, because remember, they were teaching our kids in high school. If they were going to teach grades 11 and 12, they wanted kids who could read the stuff that they liked to be able to teach in grades 11 and 12. So they had an incentive to put good passages. This is not what we're getting from these other kinds of national consortia, because it's not being done by high school English teachers. and we're missing that. But those were the kinds of standards they wanted, and then the criteria for the selection of the passages that would then mean that you would find a passage from the Odyssey, the Iliad, or the whatever for grade 10. And that was exactly what they wanted and got, because they were selecting the passages too. They're not doing that for Smart Balance or for Park. We don't know exactly who's selecting them, nor do we know what's going to be on them, because all we can ever see are those few sample items that they deign to let us see. But it's not like it's going to be a mass distribution. So this becomes very important for the quality of your high school curriculum when your teachers can help shape the standards and then select the passages for the test, because you've built in an incentive. You want teachers you want students reading the stuff that you want them to be able to read when they come into your class the next year.
Thank you. To follow up on that real quick, how does reading classical literature develop higher level critical thinking?
This is another good question which a lot of people ask and don't understand, that there's a difference between the literature that's come out since, say, 1970, and particularly 19th century novels. If you go and look at the vocabulary, it's dense with multisyllabic words. If you struggle through a Dickens novel, and I remember a wonderful English teacher in Brookline High who said, I could give Great Expectations 40 years ago in grade 9. Today, I can't give it until grade 12, because you need to be able to read long chapters, and you need to be able to read long stretches of text with multisyllabic words. And kids don't have the attention span, and they don't have the vocabulary developed. So older works were more challenging. That's why I sent kids to school. You didn't send kids to school for just enjoying work. They had to learn something that would be useful for their understanding of the language they were using. Okay. And
Good evening. My name is Paul Therian, and you mentioned Singapore. I had the opportunity and the honor of spending a lot of time with Dr. Thoreau from MIT. There, he was there doing research work on just what your discussions about the effectiveness of the educational system in Singapore. Singapore was being evaluated at that time by mainland China to guide China in setting up city-states as a model of Singapore. But they were also working on, of course, the effectiveness and so forth. And you see it today with Asian students. And
their tops.
and you brought up about the rigor. Thoreau was high on that and discussion of that. And my curiosity is, he and his staff and other universities, I'm sure, he was keen on, and he wrote a book about it, you may have read it, Head-to-Head, that we're in global competition for the students to be graduated here and everywhere. And at that time, they saw that this was 93. And we both had something in common, because I was in Beijing from 85, 6, and 7, when Deng Xiaoping, Chu Enlai, and Li Peng were trying to bring them out of communism, and they were trying to get their country rapidly established in engineering and technology, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, why was all his research? It sounds like some of it got into Massachusetts. Did it?
Not really. Anything that sounded like it was going to be more demanding somehow bypassed our education schools. I haven't talked about them, but that's where a good part of our problem is located, because that's where our teachers come from, and they are affected by the education schools they go to. They may come from demanding programs in the colleges, but they go into our education schools and have different ideas about what they should be doing in classrooms. To go back to Singapore, I want to point out that one of the major differences between other countries, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, and European countries that I know of, is that their teachers are chosen from the top 10%, 20% of the high school population. It is a prestigious occupation, because not that it's paid particularly well, I mean, it's paid no differently than other occupations, but it's considered prestigious in terms of the respect kids are supposed to give their teachers, and that these teachers come from the top of their classes, like the top 20% of their graduating high school class or their college class, and many of them for secondary level are expected to get a master's degree in their subject to make sure they know their subject before they then take pedagogical coursework to become secondary teachers. It's very prestigious, and their hours are regulated as part of the union issue in most of these countries. But the point is that teacher education is very different in most other countries. We have an open end in which we allow almost anyone to come in, and then we have very poor licensing tests. That was the one thing I worked on very hard in Massachusetts and made headway on. And I've just written a book on it, as a matter of fact, which will be published sometime next year, the teacher licensing and regulations issues. Unless you do something to revise and restructure your teacher education programs, your standards aren't going to mean anything one way or the other. If you want good standards, you've got to have teachers who can teach them. You can set up good standards, and what I was doing was both. I had the good standards being developed, and then I was putting those standards content into the licensing regs and the teacher licensure tests, because I ended up being in charge of all of that. And so I know that it's all three together that make a difference. And Common Core has only focused on standards and student assessments. That would have been, to me, the last thing to go to if I had a choice. Didn't have a choice in Massachusetts. They had already committed to student assessments. But we had to have standards developed, new tests developed for the kids, at the same time that we had to have new teacher prep programs with new licensure tests, so that, and new PD criteria, so that the teachers could teach to the standards that were being taught to the kids through the tests. So it was a circle, and it all had to be done at the same time. But to me, that accounts for what happened in Massachusetts. It's not just standards alone. And USED and Gates and others have simply missed the boat, and all they're consumed by is student tests, which is why, to me, do anything to get your kids out of those tests, because it's the teacher ed part of it that has to be corrected. You can't do anything much with your K-12 schools until you correct the decline in the teaching core and in what teachers teach in the classroom. So, however your friend was able to put this into a book, it would have been ignored where it made a difference.
Well, I never heard any feedback. I went my way, he went his.
Yeah, but
He was in a different world.
never looked at anything like how to increase rigor. They don't even want to raise the bar.
So it was a waste of time in a sense.
The standards part of it and all the implementation may not amount to anything, and then they're going to hold these poor teachers accountable.
Yeah.
When the problem is, it's their ed schools who should have been held accountable, not the teachers.
What bothers me is the sneaky way New Hampshire accepted Common Core. For example, the then president of the Senate, Theodore Gatzis, when it was supposed to go through the legislature, for the legislature to pass the bill, they met with the Board of Education and said, no, we're not going to discuss this. We'll put in the bill, we'll make sure it passes, and that's it. It was never discussed.
That is a violation of public process.
And the same thing happened with Manchester. We were promised Manchester academic standards different from Common Core, and that was supposed to have given us our waiver. But what they did is they copied and pasted 88+%, and they did not create any standards for grade 6, 7, and grade 8 as of yet.
Oh, they're still not out?
No. Well, they're out, but not the junior high. They haven't done it. It's not complete.
The others are out, yeah.
And the stems, we asked for stems. They made a motion to create them by the end of last month. They came out. There's no stems.
Well, thank your State Board of Ed and Department of Ed, in part for that, but I'm sorry that there was a lack of courage
Yep.
that they should have been.
Hi, my name is Kevin Newby, and first of all,
testing, the standardized testing and the assessment a different thing, or is it kind of the same thing? And will it go towards the grade of the student?
Oh, okay. The standardized testing does refer to these Common Core-based tests that are being given. They're standardized in the sense that they're being given all around the country, and supposedly there are psychometricians that have worked on it. We don't know much because it's being kept in private. Now, as far as grades, that I don't know if there's any policy that's been established at the national level. It may be something that is being worked out state by state, and I wouldn't know where that is right now.
I can answer that. Last year, maybe 2013, there were a couple of bills submitted that would make passing these high-stakes tests required. There was a bill that would have made it mandatory to graduate from 8th grade in high school, and there was another one that was seeking to have that same requirement for each and every grade. Fortunately, a few of us have been diligent up in Concord, and we got that defeated before it advanced.
Nice one.
Any other questions?
Thank you, Dr. Stotsky. I wanted to see if you could elaborate on the lowering of the ceiling in the math standards and how Algebra 2 is going to be sought to be the top performing classwork within the existing framework of the Common Core, and how that is going to reflect on colleges as regards to the remedial classes that students are going to be required to take, and how that might affect the SATs going forward, and what they're going to do, and the problem that they're going to be faced with.
I'll tell you as much as I know now, because as I say, this is a work in progress. But right now, Common Core's math standards, their sequence ends with a weak Algebra 2 course. This is according to Professor Milgram, and would be verified probably by Professor Rapp. And I haven't heard anyone dispute it who knows mathematics at the high school level. So if it ends with a weak Algebra 2, there are a few advanced standards that could be put into a senior year course, say kids finish it about junior year, but it's not enough for a full trig course. And that was what he is saying, that there's things missing from this weak Algebra 2, so that while it may be adequate for getting into a community college, because we had Jason Zimba, one of the math writers, come to the board meeting in Massachusetts, and he said it's basically for non-selective colleges, and it won't get kids into an engineering college. We have it on record, on tape. What happens to the engineering colleges is something I still don't understand. I've spoken to a couple of deans or professors recently who, of course, knew nothing about this. They're out to lunch on this issue. They're still thinking they're going to get kids who have come through a good trig course, because you don't necessarily have to have calculus, but trig was always required. Even when I went to high school in the 19th century, trig was required for going on to an engineering college then. So I don't know what they're going to do. They may try to have placement tests, but part of the deal with those standards called college readiness, which is now being worked on by Smarter Balance, and maybe Part 2, but Smarter Balance, I've seen the memo. They are trying to get the colleges in the state to agree, and some of their presidents did agree as part for the Race to the Top application they had to, that was one of the requirements, that they would allow anyone who passes a college readiness test in grade 11 to take for credit a freshman course. Now, this is the chess playing that people like Milgram and others do. If you've passed a grade 11 test that is in math, and the math content's no higher than Algebra 2, weak, the cut score is going to be somewhere between grade 8 and Algebra 1. It's going to be lower than the content level of the highest course you were offered. And if those kids are guaranteed a credit-bearing course in college, if they're accepted, the Common Core can't require a college to accept, but colleges, of course, have to fill up their places, otherwise the state isn't going to give them money. So there are other pressures for them to admit as many students as possible. If the kid is guaranteed a 4-credit course in the freshman year and is somewhere around the low Algebra 1 level, what is the level of that 4-credit course going to be? Remembering that the colleges have an incentive to have that kid pass the course and be retained. Otherwise, there are other threats. Pell grades, retention levels, you might get fewer appropriations. We don't know. All of this is speculative at this point. All we know is that these agreements are now finally beginning to percolate through higher ed, and the math departments are probably the last to hear of this, that they're not going to be able to give their usual placement tests. What they're going to do, we don't know. They're going to have intermediate algebra given college credit. In other words, the first 2 years of college may be what should have been in high school. It's a way of moving college down to high school, only it's going to cost an awful lot of money. Now, as Milgram says, he's at an elite school, Stanford, a private school, Harvard, MIT, CIT, Caltech. They won't lower their standards. They will simply increase, as they have been, foreign students they admit because they pay full tuition. And they're able to get as many foreign students who are prepared for those universities as they need because of their reputations. But what the state universities are going to do, I don't know yet. We don't know. It remains to be seen because there are too many interlocking pieces that have to be worked out together. Engineering schools, we have no idea. The one dean I spoke to in Colorado, who knew nothing about this, said, after 4 years, these kids expect to be through, and they also have to pass a licensure test to practice as an engineer. So, we don't know. Does it mean another 2 years they have to spend? The licensure test has to change? How can you change the licensure test, which is partly to protect the public? You want bridges to stand and tunnels not collapse. We don't know. How do you lower the standards, and what do they do to go around? There will be end games played, I'm sure. I mean, some of these professions and disciplines, nursing is another one. They've just been raising their standards. I spoke to people who were in nursing at the University of Arkansas. They had increased math requirements, and they were having a terrible attrition problem from poor areas and didn't know what to do. They have diversity requirements, but they've got accreditation requirements that say nurses need to know more math. Well, they're caught between a rock and a hard place. I don't know what they're going to do. No one knows. It's something that alert parents need to be asking questions about. School board officials just need to keep asking questions, even if you don't get answers from your state Department of Ed or your state board of ed. You've got to keep asking the questions. I couldn't get anyone to talk about what does college readiness mean, but these are ultimately far more significant questions for major professions that life and death may hang on. And we don't know at this point what lowering the level, which of course they deny. You see, this is part of the problem. I read some of the stuff that comes out for Fordham. These are rigorous standards. Well, what does that mean if the kids can't go into the kinds of 4-year sequences that they expected to go into years ago, or have been, because their math isn't there. Math is critical language today. Only most people don't understand it. I don't. It's far beyond where we are. Those who can do math and science, can look at those standards in NGSS. I mean, look at, there's no high school chemistry in NGSS, the new next generation science standards. This is what your state board is thinking of adopting. The integrated problem has gone away. Nobody wants it. But a new problem is they just got rid of chemistry at the high school level. Why? I called up somebody who was a scientist reviewing, and I said, why do you think they got rid of chemistry at the high school level? And she said, well, first of all, it requires a certain amount of math for balancing chemical equations. And secondly, it may be hard for some kids to imagine invisible things. That was, she was being flip with me. But that is how people are seeing this, that if all kids can't imagine invisible things, then get rid of the subject. Now, the physicist who looked at the physics standard says it's unteachable because there's not enough math to support the physics. Physics is, after all, in many ways, a branch of mathematics. So if you don't have the math there, you can't teach the high school physics courses. Who knows that on a state board of ed or at a local board of ed?
And I can add to that, AP Physics, even the current exam requires calculus. And if our schools are not going to be able to get our kids into calculus classes in high school, that's going to be gone. And what does that then mean for the kids moving on into those professions?
AP Calculus is going to go also,
Exactly.
and the Vice President of College Board has already indicated it doesn't fit into the Common Core sequence, which is his way of saying in a few years it'll disappear. Now, those kids right now in the pipeline, 10, 11, will be able to finish. But in another 5 years, we don't know where we're going to be in this country if we still have Common Core being imposed with heel, you know, the boot.
The bullying, the threat of
Yeah.
pulling federal and state funds. They're said, don't dare question us, do what we're told. And it's not going to take 30 years for these things to have an impact. It can be just a few
4 or
years.
5 years.
That's all it's going to take.
In California already, my friends there are saying their high schools, good high schools, are already cutting out top-level math and science courses, budgetary reasons. So parents are now trying to find out whether online courses are available for their students. That's available.
Thank you, Dr. Stotsky.
Sorry, to sound like a
My
problem.
name is Bill McKenzie.
I can't hear you.
Goffstown, former school board member of Goffstown, and I've kept track of education matters for quite a long time. I was taken totally by surprise as to how Common Core came in. I inquired at our school board, and not a single school board member could recollect any type of school board discussion relating to Common Core's implementation.
That's right.
The only mention in all of the school board minutes that Superintendent Balke could supply to me was a reference to under old business. If you can believe it, it shows up as old business and working on curriculum matters. And it was just 2 mentions of it since, 2010.
Yep.
In 1998, there was a national school to work
Yeah.
all grantee meeting held. And I obtained this paper from State Department records. At the time I was a school board member, or just after, in fact. And one of the comments of the attendees discussing school to work, which I believe has just morphed into Common Core.
Well, it was by someone who had a role in Common Core, Mark Tucker. Yeah. It has some similarities philosophically.
The general dumbing down,
Mhm.
the diminishing of the academics, and giving the student a choice, a job that they only have choice, if you understand the behavioral aspect of that. But one of the attendees said, this is about changing the government. And of course, we knew Common Core was being pushed on us from Washington.
Well,
And we didn't have anything much to say about that. And the same thing is happening with Common Core. In that flexible waiver, the New Hampshire flexible waiver, on about page 92, there's a little chart showing a pyramid. And on the left side, the left half of the pyramid, it has, this is, by the way, titled The Three-Tier Model of Prevention and Intervention. On the left side of the pyramid, it has to do with the intervention according along academic lines. Fine, okay, try to help the student out if they need extra help. The right half of the pyramid is behavior systems intervention. And it includes all students. And in the old Common Core, or the old OBE, outcome-based, it had to do with the affective domain, trying to change the behavior of a student. And I believe, the State Department wouldn't answer me straight on this particular chart. They denied that they were getting involved with intervening on behavioral correction for any students.
at this point, one of our problems is that you may not get a straight answer.
You don't.
Any question you ask, so you don't know what to believe. We have low levels of trust everywhere now. I mean, parents simply can't believe what they're told, even by their own superintendent. There has been so little real information, and the general messages don't give out information. Keep everything quiet, get it through. I mean, this is deliberate on what, as far as what Gates did. There was a Washington Post article a few weeks ago that had a long interview with him, and this was all deliberate. Just don't have discussions, get it through, and then let it get through quietly. Local school boards weren't told anything in advance because they didn't want opposition. So I was told this in Massachusetts. State board votes, and then there's a little note that goes to local school boards afterwards, telling them they don't have.
Don't you think that the data mining that's attached to the State Department's behavioral conditioning?
That's another issue, you're right. And I don't go into the data mining because we don't really know yet what's going to happen with it. But when the kids go for testing, they're going to be asked for a lot of information. And that's the other reason why it's useful for parents simply not to let their kids take the test. Because we don't know what this information is going to be used for.
Yeah, and if you read the waiver in reference to the RTI, response to intervention programs, and the technical aspect of what's been going on in the schools, it all aligns towards, well, the half of it is behavioral intervention for changing children's thinking according to what the State Department wants. And the advanced placement history standards, which have come out and are controversial now across the country, show where they're aiming the children's thinking. The history standards, as Lynn Cheney criticized them, back in the 90s, they're going to twist the minds of the children so drastically they won't know which way they're going at the end of the year.
We're going to finish up with one last question here.
And my question is regarding local school districts and their adoption of their own curriculum. For example, in Windham, we have our own curriculum that is based on the Common Core, and we are going to move to the smarter bounds of testing. However, I can assure you that we teach calculus. My daughter is in an AP calculus course. She's in there with 25 other students, and there's probably another 20 25 to 50 students, maybe even more, that take regular calculus, and AP physics, and chemistry, and
Those are all still there because they're finishing up.
So you think that once we're aligned, fully aligned with the Common Core, that as a school district, we will just get rid of those?
It's happening.
Well, I can assure you that we've adopted our own curriculum here at Windham that still includes all those things.
Okay.
So the question for you is, what is your comments, concerns with school districts that may choose to do more than the minimum Common Core standard?
Well, they ought to. Most schools should, but Common Core isn't a base for it, you see. They're the wrong standards. One way to look at it is, some people have said, well, in some ways they're too easy, and in some ways they're too hard at the early grade level. The best comment I've heard is that they're the wrong standards, and Milgram will say in math, and I say I'm not a mathematician, so I can't give you the details, he will say the support you need for the higher level math courses is not there.
That's right.
So that once you have installed or implemented Common Core through grade 9, 10, and then the test is given in 11, you don't have the support that you need for your full trigonometry, pre-calculus, and calculus course, which is why Trevor Packard, the vice president of College Board, about 5 months ago said that he just wanted to let people know that calculus does not fit into the Common Core sequence. In other words, in a few years, they won't even offer it. It's gone. And so, it's, as I said, the kids right now in the immediate pipeline are fine. Schools like yours will keep these. I'm sure Brookline High is going to make sure it's keeping these courses for those kids who are there. And in one school system, Hopkinton, that I asked the curriculum specialist, what was he planning for the future? There will be one class each grade for those kids who are able to take the more accelerated sequence in math. But what that means is that the broader group of kids who might have been able to take it in the past will no longer be able to. If you show real promise and they have the accelerated sequence, then maybe it will be there and they'll do it. In California, I'm told they're taking these courses away in the junior, senior year. And so parents have been contacting me and Professor Milgram to say, where can we get? And that's why we're mentioning looking for online courses. But it's all different in different schools. There's no one pattern, because each school system is trying to figure out with its own math and science people what it can do. And remember, senior math and science people may retire. And once you lose a teacher of your trig and pre-calculus courses, there weren't that many Brookline High who taught those courses, who do you get as a replacement? That's where the teacher problem comes in. You may get, and I've looked at the accreditation standards for the new ones for teacher schools, education schools, and they must now train prospective teachers to Common Core. Now, if they're doing that in math, it means they will train them to teach no more than a week algebra 2. So, in a few years, if you're hiring a new math teacher who's just come out of an accredited ed school training program, they can't even teach above that. The best math teacher I knew my kids had when they went to Brookline, I had a master's degree in math. He knew math. But I don't know that they're going to be in our high schools in a few years. It's not clear where we are. Your school system may have these courses, and if you're on a school board or an active parent, you want to figure out how to make sure that those courses are always available. They were never required for high school graduation for all kids. No one ever did that. Although in some countries, they come closer to a requirement for all kids, some form of whatever those courses are. But you have to figure out how to make sure that your advanced courses stay there and that the support that's needed in the lower grades, like learning the standard algorithms earlier rather than later, having a stronger middle school. This is where Milgram really sees the problem. The middle school just gets to be very weak, so that kids can't complete an Algebra 1 by grade 8. They have to wait till grade 9 to complete it. That's a huge difference right there, just that 1 year for the math sequence. So what you can do, I mean, you're lucky your children will get through with what's there in place for them, but there are the other issues, the larger issues, the economic issues, technological issues for the country as a whole, whether these courses are going to be available in most high schools. Let me just say, this was something that I always thought about because I went to a public high school, a small one, and the comparison that we always used to make was with private schools. Private schools offered the best, and it was up to good public schools to try to be as close to a good private school as possible, so that parents who couldn't afford an Exeter or a St. Paul or St. Ronald Sex Complex, whatever the schools were in that whole series of boarding schools, could nevertheless get a pretty good education. That was what James Bryan Conant did with the American high school reforms in the 50s and 60s, which you may not remember, but it affected almost all high schools in this country. He was the president of Harvard, who led a group of people to look at how to beef up math and science in our public high schools. And he was the one who helped to get AP courses introduced into our public high schools, because what he said was that we need to be able to draw on more than these elite boarding schools for our universities and elite colleges in this country. We need to tap our public high schools more than we have. And right now, a lot of us see us undoing that old set of reforms that took place in the 50s and 60s and going back to something that existed in the 20s and 30s, basically.
Well, thank you, Dr. Stotsky. We very much appreciate you taking the time to come up here and speak to us. Your stuff is here. And I'd like to thank all the public who turned out tonight. This video at some point, I believe, will be up on the Windham Academy website. I believe, is that going to happen, Tom? Yeah.
YouTube, be on YouTube.
It'll be
Just
on
put
YouTube.
Windham, Dr. Stotsky.
So again, I'd like to thank everyone for showing up, and thank everyone for their great questions, and